Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Rosenlund, and I am going to be the host for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us wherever you are. In fact, it looks like I should say good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others, because we have folks from here in the US and North America, as well as folks from Europe today. So thank you for joining us. Our presentation today is about business agility and FinTech, or financial technologies. But I would suggest that the topics we'll cover today apply to other industries as well, but you're going to see that we've kind of tuned the presentation to what we're seeing in FinTech. We have two terrific speakers today. It's gratuitous for me to say so, but I'll introduce them in a moment. I say they're excellent speakers because I've seen both of them speak in person a number of times, and they are. More importantly, they're subject matter experts as well. So take advantage of the opportunity today to ask questions and pick their brain. So today's agenda is very straightforward. We have this brief introduction, which I'm conducting right now. We'll have our guest presenter and our own Phil Heijkoop present. And then there will be a Q&A session. We've left at least 15 minutes for Q&A, probably more. So we want you to take advantage of that opportunity. I'll tell you now that the Q&A is handled by the Q&A feature. Each of you will see a button at the bottom of your screen. Your microphones are muted throughout the webinar. We're recording this so that it can be posted on YouTube later. And we find the less open microphones, the better, so that we can cut down on the crying babies, dogs, and in my case today, I think the garbage truck is going to show up any minute now and loudly empty the garbage. But well, hopefully that doesn't happen, and hopefully we can keep the noise, the extraneous noises at a minimum. So use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. And my suggestion is always to write down the questions as you think of them, or type in your questions as you think of them. We will answer them all at the end of the session, or at least we'll answer as many as we can. And if we don't get to all the questions, we will follow up with you directly to answer your question. And if that's something you want to make sure that we can do, don't submit your question anonymously. No one else sees who's asking the questions except for the panelists today. And we'll only follow up with you if we don't get to answer your question live. As I mentioned, the session's being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel in a day or two so that you can review it again, share it with a colleague, try to make it go viral for us, whatever you like to do with that recorded session in a couple days. As I said, we have two excellent speakers today. Let me introduce them. Dan Moran is a consulting agile coach, scrum master, and program manager at Slalom Consulting. Slalom is a US-based technology and business consulting company that focuses on strategy, technology, and business transformation. Before becoming a consultant, in fact, we first got to know Dan when he was a customer. So before becoming a consultant, he had more than 10 years of project management leadership experience for companies like Boeing, Disney, and MySpace. Remember them? He's also an expert on lightweight processes and agile frameworks. And interestingly, I think he's the leader of the Orange County ACE, or Atlassian Community Events group, formerly called OGS, or Atlassian User Groups. So that's how I know Dan, from his role there primarily. So welcome, Dan. In addition, we have our own Phil Heijkoop. Phil is the lead solutions engineer for ALM Works. He's a recovering developer who enjoys teaching people new things. And he and his team help ALM Works customers maximize their success with our products. At least that's part of what he does. Like many small companies, we all wear many different hats. But he is an expert on our products in the context of customer settings. So he's frequently on site with customers or working with them these days remotely to solve their Jira and structure challenges. As I said, it's gratuitous for me to say so. They're both excellent speakers, but you can decide that for yourself as we go today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to be our first presenter today. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks very much, Dave. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My pleasure to be here chatting about some of the challenges I've seen in my work in consulting and previous to that when I was doing Agile program management, and how I've used structure for Jira to help with some of the challenges I've met. So we're going to talk today about ways to build sustainable Agile processes. Jira itself can work very well for all sorts of ways to scale Agile, whether it's SAFe, DAD, or any other methodology. It can also work well when you're just referring to your own teams as programs. If you have several teams that are associated together and you need to be able to look at their work as a whole, you just think of that as program management. Jira can do a great job, but we do find that it has limitations out of the box without any add-ons. There's, from a reporting standpoint, it has some Agile reports. You can do some querying and display a set of issues as a result of a query. You can dump that to Excel, CSV, but there's not a lot of other things you can do internally. So I'm going to share with you today some real-world insights that I've gathered during my time consulting for the past year at a large US financial services company with a very large technology component. And we're also going to talk about how to set up Jira so that you're open, but not too open. So you can deal with the various regulatory challenges that we find in the financial services and FinTech sectors. Now, the problem that we've seen time and time again is that, let me just make sure I didn't, I thought I skipped a slide, beg your pardon. The time and time again is that management, meaning delivery managers, scrum masters, program managers, release train engineers, if you're doing SAFe, have said to me as a consultant that they want to understand in a much deeper way their backlogs, their dependencies, the workload of their teams, the health of their releases. And they've said, well, we want this available in Jira directly, or maybe through a Jira dashboard, or maybe embedded into a Confluence page. And they've just asked, how can we do that? And for those of you who are very familiar with Jira, out of the box, there's not a lot of ways to do this. You can view a backlog by looking at the backlog directly, but there's a lot of information on a backlog page, for example. There's no easy way in Jira to visualize dependencies, workload. There's some buttons on the backlog that sort of give you a sense of that. And releases, there's a release screen, but you have to do several clicks to get into a release for its details. So let's have Phil talk a little bit about the way we think about Jira to set it up so that we can do some of the reporting I'm describing. Go ahead, Phil.
Thanks, Dan. That's definitely a component. So as we mentioned, Jira is pretty good out of the box. It's also pretty flexible in terms of how you, hold on, there we go. It's also pretty flexible on how you can set it up in terms of how you allocate projects, Jira projects in that sense, where do you place different issue types, and how you link them with your dependencies. You can have a single dependency type, or you can have multiple ones if that's something you want to set up. And a lot of this is directly will impact things that you have at your disposal in terms of options or limitations down the road. And while Jira is an open tool and they very much espouse the open way of working, sometimes you need to close things down for a variety of reasons. They can be, as Dan mentioned, regulatory. They can just be kind of confidentiality issues. And so we recommend, and we're going to go through some of the basic setups for Jira, and then kind of what are the considerations you're going to have in terms of this is something you want to limit by design versus this is something you want to be free about because you want to have as many options coming down the road to do reporting, for example. And this directly impacts us in the project management and the program management space because we're interested in not just knowing what the teams are working about, but we also need to know how they're doing this. And in particular, from a compliance perspective, we need to make sure they're doing things correctly and we're not missing information that might be important later down the road. And so we're going to take that approach to be proactive about a lot of these things, to set up Jira to help us make a lot of these decisions, and to basically guide us to have good behavior, good habits. And we're going to use some of the tooling like Jira automation to kind of make sure that the validation of a lot of these assumptions are going to be baked into how our projects work. And then I guess we're going to also talk a little bit on structure and the add-on. And I think Dan's going to share with us some of the examples that he's used successfully in his professional life.
Thanks a lot, Phil. I mentioned earlier that I found structure for Jira to be a great solution for doing the kind of visualizations that the people have been asking me for in the management community at my client. So if you've ever heard of structure, the thing you create with it is called a structure. And so I've created a set of structures as a proof of concept for an integrated suite of reports for program management. And I've started implementing that suite in various teams that I work with at my client. So I'm going to display for you today a selection of these structures that I found to be most useful for people in FinTech and financial services who need to see visibility that would matter to Scrum Masters, development managers, program managers, etc. And a lot of this does apply in a Scaled Agile Framework sort of environment, but that could apply to Scrum at Scale, Nexus, Less, or any environment where you really need to see what a whole program, what a whole set of teams are doing in various boards. So Phil, let's talk about to silo or to not silo.
Yes, so one of the things that impacts the usage structure in particular, but every add-on, generally speaking, is you build on top of your Jira data. And so one of the first things that we need to decide, as we mentioned earlier, is about that openness versus how close we want to be. And silo has become a bit of a dirty word because we want to break down silos and be as agile as possible. And as a general rule, that's entirely the best way to do things. But sometimes we need to create some silos to protect ourselves, but also to kind of enforce certain limitations that we want to put on the system. And so from a practical perspective, there's two angles we want to come at this. There's the permission aspect of it. And so we want to make sure that the data that we put inside Jira and the permissions that we associate with it in terms of who can access it reflects the way the company thinks about the data that lives there. And so the two main ones that I want to talk about are project level permissions and then the issues that live inside them. So we can talk about the projects in terms of who has access to seeing the projects. And this should be tied very much to the users and what their roles are. And Jira actually very handily comes with a set of user roles and user groups that you can customize to mirror the way the organization is set up, to reflect different access levels and different permissions. And so typically you'll have administrators who administer Jira but don't particularly care about the content that lives in Jira. They're not looking at the issues for what's inside them, but they're looking at what's the performance of the Jira setup. How do I need to change things, whether it's add access or stuff like that. You have people who are users who just need to get data outside of Jira and put data inside it. And then you have a little bit of hybrid users in the middle there who have project level admin perspectives and rights. And they need to be able to set up their project and they know what they're doing to enable their users to be as effective and efficient as possible. And so it's important that the permissioning setup that you have for Jira reflect the organizational paradigm for who has access to what information, but also how do I give someone access to that? Because changing permissions is fairly easy, but you want to make sure that there's a good process in place to say, if someone has just been onboarded, has he gone through the requisite, compliance, courses, whatever the organization has, before we give him access to all this sensitive information. On top of that, I believe we're going to be talking about the issue architecture as well. And this is actually, it's a little old, as you can tell by the fact that Jira is still spelled in all caps. But this is from one of our customers that was working in the financial services industry. And what we wanted to focus on here is that you're going to have multiple projects and the issues inside them, and how you relate them to each other with the issue links is important because it's a foundational piece of information that you can build on later. And so the two things I would like to stress and recommend is that different teams have their own Jira project. It allows for a lot more flexibility for the teams to customize the way they work, but at the same time, it allows the team backlog to stay within that Jira project. And then the second thing I'd like to point out is that there are exceptions to be made, but relatively speaking, you want to keep as few different types of issue links as possible. So if something blocks another, use the blocking link type. And there might be cause for adding more to reflect a different relationship, and there might be a very good reason to add it, but you don't want to get into a Jira setup where, I've seen this before, you have 50 different issue link types, a lot of them with overlapping names, and then it becomes very, very hard to organize all these things across projects. And so when you're trying to scale a lot of your practices, that becomes much more of a hurdle that you have to cross versus something that you can use to turbocharge the way you're doing things. And then this integration across teams should basically be something we all agreed upon. So while a team has liberty to set up their project a certain way, there should definitely be an overarching plan in terms of how are these teams going to be talking to each other, how we're going to be managing dependencies, and how we're going to be sharing this information. Because as we often see, I may be working on project one or project A's team, but I really do care about the dependencies that I have with these other teams because they impact the work that I need to do. And so having a consistent way of documenting dependencies, blockers, enablers, stuff like that, enables everyone to get the information much faster and much quicker. And finally, I want to stress that now it's baked in, but a lot of people had this kind of in the form of an add-on. There's automation that you can build inside Jira. And there are two different types that I want to suggest we really use. One is informational assumptions. So oftentimes we will assume certain information exists because an epic has an owner. This field needs to be filled in. And so if we make these assumptions, then we can build in automation to create and validate that, which means that you can't create an epic, click create without filling in the owner field. You can add a default for that just to have messages that get triggered and sent to different people. And doing this allows you to not have different issues that can be created by one team that slip through the cracks because someone else is filtering by owner and they don't see it. And so having these assumptions validated through automation that you can build into Jira out of the box nowadays makes it so much easier because then everybody else can basically build off of these assumptions because they're baked in and they are true. The second type that I want to include and stress the use of is a judicious use of notifications. What that means is various times people will have notifications triggered based on status transitions, changes in certain fields. And while that can be helpful, because definitely there are times where you want to get that kind of information, sometimes when there are so many notifications, people get flooded with them and they can't pick out the ones that are important anymore. And so you don't want an email every 10 minutes from Jira because then you're going to ignore the emails that come out of Jira. And so the automated email system is definitely something that can be helpful if used correctly and judiciously. And so rather than giving someone access to the full fire hose and giving everybody the ability to say, oh yeah, send a notification to all the watchers of this issue every time somebody updates something. Be judicious, definitely send the notifications, but only when there are important updates. So changes of assignee, changes to due dates, definitely important information. But maybe those things don't really matter if there is no change in, for example, the assigned sprint date for the story, in which case we're not really talking about information that impacts the greater organization because the due date moved from Tuesday to Thursday. Well, if it still finishes in that sprint, the organization doesn't need an email across everybody who's watching that particular story. And so this is just kind of a bit of a toy example, but relatively speaking, it's important to be judicious with the use of these notifications because they're very powerful. And as such, you don't want to use them all the time. You want to use them responsibly. And so that's definitely something worth keeping in mind as you kind of set up your Jira. So I'm going to kick it back over to Dan to give us some examples of how he's used this.
Thanks a lot, Phil. I mentioned earlier that there are several key areas where people in management and team leadership have been saying to me, we want to get better insights as to what's going on in our team's Jira instance. So let's look at a few of those. The first area is backlog management. As I mentioned earlier, you can direct people to go to the team's backlog, but it's very hard to decipher from that what's really going on. It's very granular, it's very tactical. It's where the team actually organizes their backlog and their sprint backlog. So we want to provide a higher level of view in this program management context so that a stakeholder, an executive can see all the work being done by one or more teams. Now, where I'm working now, I'm often suggesting to teams that they not only have their epics well defined, but they define a layer above that for initiatives. And you can see in this illustration here, initiatives are the ones with the blue icon, epics are the ones with the purple icons. And you can relate initiatives and epics together just using the parent link field that you get if you're using Portfolio for Jira, or you can use other custom link types as Phil mentioned. But if you use structure, you can reflect that hierarchy in this structure. I call it an initiative structure, where I can see the high-level initiatives that a team have defined. Initiatives being things that might last at least 6 months to 18 months, let's say 2 years, or maybe they're just ongoing. Below that are their associated epics. Below the epics are their associated stories and tasks. And one great thing that I like about structure is I can totally customize what columns are showing up. So what data shows up for each type of structure. And this one, I thought that if I'm providing this for an executive context or managerial context, I want to see the overall progress of each item, the summation of all the story points, what team it's assigned. We use a custom field called assign team to be able to say, send work to different teams, and who the actual assignee is. So this view, in one quick view, tells me pretty much everything I need to know about the high level sense of what's going on for my teams, because I can pull together work from several different Jira projects, several different Jira boards, if I wish, into one view. Now, what can I do with this? I mentioned earlier, people are asking for this to be available through a link. So there's a direct link to a structure in Jira, but it can also be placed onto a Jira dashboard or onto a Confluence page. Let's look at another example. This is the same data set, but we're looking just at epics, and they're sorted in rank order, so priority order. Now you could say to me, well, Dan, you could just go to the backlog view and look at the epic pane on the left and see all the epics listed there, and you could even drag them up and down. Yes, you can, but it's sort of a kludgy interface. It's not meant for really focusing on the epics and what's going on with them. It's more about the stories and associating with epics. So this view that I've created here in structure shows me just a straight list of all the epics of one or more teams, what their progress is, status, and summation of story points. Note that that summation of story points that you've seen on this slide and the previous one is extremely powerful, and there's no way that I know of to do that in Jira in one simple interface, because Jira just doesn't do summation. It's not designed to do that in any of its out-of-the-box reporting. So this is exactly what a lot of people have been asking for, that we want to see how many story points are in this epic altogether, so they can see that. But if they use the little arrows next to each item, they can dig into exactly what stories are associated with each epic. And what I love best about this view is I use it often with product owners to say, let's just focus on the epics and put them in priority order, a stack ranked order, which will really help us determine our order of operations. And having that visibility and focus on just an epic has been really powerful for our product ownership community. The next area that I'm asked a lot about is dependency management, which in my experience in project and program management has been one of the biggest challenges facing a lot of different corporations. And so I wanted to create really simple views saying what's related to what. That's what I wanted to know. What's dependent on what? Now we're using the issue links that Phil talked about earlier, specifically the is blocked by / blocked relationship. And so relying on that as a way of saying, this is how we define dependencies. I wanted to say how are epics dependent on each other and how are stories and tasks depend on each other. This first view is just about the epics. Now, epics are especially thought of as being dependent on each other if you're doing SAFe, you're doing program increment planning, you're using those red pieces of yarn you could connect together features, which map to epics often in Jira in most instances I've seen. So this view just says, This epic, Thunderbolts of Zeus, is dependent on golden attendant clients. And forgive all the allusions to mythology. One of my colleagues loves mythology, so he set up a lot of this test data, which I've then manipulated. So you can say at a high level what epics are dependent on each other. That's what's this structure showing us. What is the status of each of those epics and their progress towards completion? This is the same idea, but applied at the story and task level. So it's much more tactical. And to me, I think of this in the context of Scrum of Scrums. So if you're using the Scrum of Scrums idea where representatives from each of several Scrum teams, usually the Scrum Master, maybe product owner, meet on a regular basis, perhaps weekly, to meet. And when we do that, which is a great idea for a meeting, but teams often say to me, what do we discuss in those meetings? And I say, well, one of the big focuses should be on your dependencies. So this is a view that you'd use live in that meeting and say, what are the actual dependencies we have right now? And what are the status of all that? What's the status of all that work? In other words, are any dependent items falling behind? Are they going to deliver when we hope they will deliver by the end of a certain sprint, for instance, so that the dependent team can get their work done as well?
I want to just briefly add to that. So one of the things that you can do from a row level or from a dependency level is switch between what we call bound and unbound dependencies. And the simplest way to look at this is, hopefully getting the video to play, is that you have a top level items of all the stories that you care about, and you can pull these in from a board quite simply. And using a series of filters that you can predefine, you can specify, I only want to see the dependencies between this team and that team. And you can turn these off. They're easily toggleable. So team A and team B. And at the same time, at the right, you can see that that summation of story points also updates. So when I look at team B's dependencies versus all of my dependencies, I can see exactly how many story points of potential dependencies I have. And obviously this works across other things. So expected work, WSGIF, business value, anything else can easily be summed up. And the reason this is super helpful is because when you're talking to your team, you want to see the dependencies relative to the work that you're going to do. But when you're talking to the product owner, for example, the Scrum Master of another team, you do care about third-party dependencies or other team dependencies, but the conversations are almost always going to be centered around the dependencies between your two teams. And having a single toggle that can just pull up just the conversation items that you need to be focused on right now, and you can group them by the sprints that they're scheduled in or anything along those lines as well. It allows you to really drill down and say, all right, these are the conversations we need to have this week. And both of you guys can pull this up because this is all just the same Jira data that both of you have access to. And so that really helps you kind of get that information. And especially in larger organizations where there are a lot of dependencies, having a way to filter them down, depending on the conversation you're going to have, usually saves you time having to scroll through, having different sorting orders, stuff like that. And so it's a real time saver to just be able to toggle these things real quick.
Thanks, Phil. The other area that I'm asked a lot about are, how do I see if I'm, let's say, a manager and a manager of people that are in several different teams, each of which have their own sprints, how do I understand what's going on in the sprints without having to actually go to each team's Scrum board? So let's take a look at that. There we go. So this view here shows you the sprints of several different teams that are going on at the same time, both active sprints that are going on now and the upcoming sprints. So often, just the other day, a manager said to me, well, my people are in several different Scrum teams, but I want to have some sense of what's going on for them so I can help them if they need some help or some support, just also for awareness. So I developed this view to just say, list out all the sprints for several different teams. What are the items there and what are the story points of those items? Something very, very quick and easy to absorb. Another thing those same people asked, and I sort of alluded to it a moment ago, is that a lot of managers want to make sure their people aren't over allocated. One of the Agile principles is that teams are sustainable. They can keep on doing their work indefinitely without being overworked. And also we don't want people under allocated. Now, depending on the paradigm you use, if you use the paradigm where team members actually volunteer to do items in sprint planning. So they know what they're going to do this sprint, rather than the more traditional agile paradigm where you pick up items from the to-do column as the sprint's underway, which was fine. But in the former paradigm, the view that I'm showing you here will often work to say, well, for this sprint, here's each person, myself and one of my colleagues, here's all the work that they've volunteered to do. And that would show you stories, tasks, or even subtasks. And if there's stories or tasks or whatever you're pointing, that would show you that in the rightmost column. Now, this particular data set isn't very impressive, but when you see 5 or 6 items assigned to one person and somebody else has 15, you can know that that person with 15 needs a break, some of that work needs to be reallocated. And one use case in which I use this view, other than just while the sprint's underway, is during sprint planning. When you're nearing the end of a sprint planning and you're saying, well, let's see, have we given too much work to any one person in the team? You'd pull up this view and see that live. I'm also asked a lot about the releases. Now, at the company I'm working at now, they use the release feature pretty extensively. They have small releases and major ones, just like a lot of other companies. They have to be very structured in their releases, partially because they're a strong IT organization trying to use best practices, but also because they're in the financial services sector. They need to be able to have some very robust documentation around what's in each release. This view talks about the status of the releases. And in the example you see here, I'm showing the 3 releases that are already ready to go to production, versions, in this example, 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. You can see what's associated with those. They're very small releases, as you can see by the number of items in each. But I've also shown an epic link view. So at a glance, you can see what epics are represented in these releases and the progress towards the completion. Version 1.3 would, in this example, would be the release that teams are working on right now. And you can see that they're about 35, 40% done, but it's a much bigger release, 58 story points total. So this is something that people who can be in a release management role or an overall overarching managerial role would be really interested in. Phil, do you want to talk about this view?
Yeah, I wanted to build a little bit on tracking releases and using the ability to query some of that information to basically build kind of an overview of the release health. And obviously, this works for the sprints and for the epics as well. What we can simply do is just query about the due date and the status. So if an item is, for example, on track to be released, so we haven't passed the due date yet, or we've already completed the item, then we can say everything's on track. If we've passed the due date, or if we go over a prescribed item, so if it's over budget, anything along those lines, we can set very easy markers to just define what that risk is. And so it allows you to add a little bit of color to your Jira view. And it also allows you to have a quick glance to see things. So for example, we can look at the amount of overdue items in a particular release. So if we're planning a release and we realize that there are a few items that are overdue and they haven't been completed yet, this tells us at one glance, all right, there's one item, I open the folder that it contains and I can see, all right, story 16, a certain Han Solo hasn't done his work, so we're gonna have to have a conversation with Mr. Solo. And the whole point around it is to get the information at a glance, because oftentimes what you can do with this, and obviously this can be in a dashboard with multiple views, as we'll show you in a minute. You go in, you check in, is anything out of the ordinary? Does this need my attention right now? And if so, you'll get that indicator, and you can do it just simply numerically saying counting overdue items, or you can have a much more complicated calculation that goes in and just giving you a rough on track, at risk, high risk, overdue, whatever nomenclature you end up using to define health. You can add a little emoji, adds a little color, it draws the eye. And so it definitely helps to get that information at a glance. And especially when you're sharing these dashboards across different teams, it'll help also without having to explicitly communicate, oh, team A is busy right now because something just popped up and is at risk. So we can definitely assume that they're on the ball there because they've seen this as well. So as I mentioned, and I think Dan mentioned as well, I wanted to briefly show that we can put all this information together. We can put it in a dashboard, we can put it on a Confluence page. And so that single view now becomes multiple views, and you can open and close both the individual gadget, but also the folders inside them. So you can actually have a place where some of the information is actionable too. So you can update things like the assignee or the status. And so we see this a lot for people that want or that have to deal with multiple teams. They'll build a dashboard that everybody can access at the same time. And then you'll see basically things like, all right, how are the stories doing? Are we on target for budget? Are we on target for release? And then if so, great. And then we can go deal with other things. And if not, then we can go deal with that. And so all that information is a central place that everybody can access. And that really, really helps with sharing that information and empowering everyone. Dan, I don't know if you wanted to share some of the ways you use the dashboards as well.
I've used it in very similar ways, Phil. In fact, a lot of my dashboards look like just like this one, where I'm showing burn down gadgets, other agile metrics. But adding structures to dashboards have really revolutionized the way dashboards are used at my current client, because it's very much live data that's customized to the environment. So let's say if there's a certain program with a program management function or release train engineer, there can be a bunch of gadgets for him or her, but anyone else who's interested in the status of that program. So it can get down into the dirt, into the weeds, like the burn down gadgets for sprints, or the sprint health gadget is a very popular one. But you can also have that program view using the structures, and it can all be mixed together on the dashboard. And same with the Confluence example, that Confluence is great because not only can it pull in structure data and also other items from Jira, queries, for example, but it can also be modified by a human using wiki markup, so that we can actually use that for, let's say, as an example, a project status dashboard that's about like high level status, something that you report up to management with all the information you need. And you can be as detailed as you want to be.
Awesome. So that kind of concludes most of the things we wanted to talk about today. So kind of just quickly summarizing what we discussed, it's important to build sustainable agile processes. In this case, a slightly more emphasis on sustainable, because we want the teams to be able to keep working and be efficient and reliant on the tools they have, know how to work them, and then get everything out of it. We don't want you to fight the tool, whether it's Jira or Structure or anything else. And as I said, adapt Jira to whichever Jira agile methodology you end up using. So whether you end up with a safe DAD, less scrums, Spotify, or something in the middle that turns out to be some sort of hybrid chimeric option between these methodologies, you can tweak Jira to suit exactly what your needs are. And that's a really powerful thing. But it's definitely something you should do going into the process with some thought and communicating with the different stakeholders. And one of the things that we really wanted to share, and I think that Dan can definitely attest to this, is that it really helps to talk to your industry peers. So whether you're directly in FinTech or insurance, which might be slightly related, there are definitely people that you can talk to in the community, because the Atlassian community is so strong and so open that you can share war stories, talk about how you set up Jira, why you made certain decisions and why they turned out to be a bad idea. I mean, it's definitely something that we also encourage. Like we've all made mistakes too, and we've had to go back to square one and fix things. But those are definitely lessons that we can learn and we can share. And finally, I just wanted to, like I said, decide how open you can be. A lot of times we want to be open by default as agile practitioners and people who are big believers in agile processes. But sometimes we run into just the legal element of it or the compliance element that we need to not be fully open, and that's okay. And we can take that into account as we design both the process aspect of it and the tooling aspect of it, in order to help everybody get everything out of it while being responsible about what we're doing. That, I believe, brings us to the Q&A section. So I'm going to hand it back over to Dave.
Indeed, it does, Phil. Thank you. So as a matter of fact, I'll read it to you in a moment, but the very first question is, what you just commented on is a great segue into the very first question we have from the audience. So just a quick reminder for everyone, Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We have a number in the queue, but we also have time for Phil and Dan to answer as many questions as they can for you. Take advantage of this, quote unquote, free consulting opportunity, if you will. Get your questions in the queue and I'll be reading them to Dan and Phil. All right, so Dan, the first question is addressed to you. And as I said, Phil's last comment about in the summary comments is a great segue into this question. As you and Phil have mentioned, there are regulatory concerns in FinTech that may not apply in other industries. So how do we strike the right balance between being open and complying?
The balance can be hard, but interestingly, the company I'm at now, as I mentioned, a large financial services company, actually is very open about their data within the company. Obviously, the exterior, so to speak, is locked down. All of the Jira is set up so that it can't be viewed from outside the company without accessing their network through their VPN. So because that defense is so strong within the company, they've actually set themselves up with a lot of openness, and that's part of their company's spirit, that they want to be as transparent as possible. So Agile makes a lot of sense to them from that perspective. So as far as project permissions, they don't do a lot of situations where projects are really tightly locked down. Like they've set it up so that for most projects, all members of all the Jira users within the company can view their projects. If you think about the Jira user permission, everyone can view most projects unless there really truly is some sensitivity. So they take that approach rather than locking everything and then only unlocking certain elements. They do the opposite. They unlock most things and only lock judiciously, which I admire. I think that's a great way to go. It's what I suggest to my clients generally, if they're not already doing it. And they lock things down using permissions, typically at the project level. They also use the roles that Phil talked about in that one slide where the roles were listed off on the left. They use those roles very carefully. So project administrators there's very few of those. Project manager, they may have a role called project manager where people have some additional capabilities, and then most typical team members are just project team members. And so they can do most things you'd expect in a Scrum or any sort of Agile environment.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Phil, the next question I guess is for you. We're a FinTech company and we're thinking of moving to Jira Cloud. Will we be able to do the kinds of things that you showed today on Jira Cloud?
Most of the things you can do right away right now. There's a few things to keep in mind because cloud is a little different than server, both from a practical perspective, from a security perspective, things like that. But probably 90%, 95% of the things I showed you right now, you can do out of the box. There are a few things that are probably true about the entire cloud ecosystem. And that's that there's a little bit of lag when you compare server features to cloud features. Part of that is just because cloud is newer. Servers had a thriving ecosystem for several years now, and cloud is much newer. So people have had to catch up because it's not a simple port. That said, everything else that I've shown you in terms of structure features are planned if they aren't already implemented. So it's definitely something that if it isn't already available, you can assume it will be in relatively short order and plan accordingly.
And follow-up question from the same person just now. Dan, are you seeing in your consulting work people doing these sorts of things on Jira Cloud?
I haven't yet, only because all of my clients have used the server version, mainly for regulatory reasons and security reasons. Although I think Jira Cloud is quite safe. Certainly when we talk about financial services, my guess, also based on my experience, is that you're going to see more examples of either being on Jira Server or in the case of my current client, because of its size, they're on Jira Data Center. But the structure seems to work identically between server and data center. I've never noticed any sort of difference whatsoever. But I've not seen a lot of cloud yet in my experience in FinTech. Although like for a smaller company, newer company, I think that could make a lot of sense.
Awesome, thank you. I guess the next question is really for both of you, or I'd ask both of you to respond to this. You showed a number of interesting structures today. What's the best way for me to create sample structures and then share them with others?
I can start, Phil, or you can if you'd like.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky in that my current client, where I'm providing sort of these consultative services about Jira, they have a QA instance of Jira they've set up. So it's totally separate. It has a bunch of fake data in it. They allow people to go and play in there as like a sandbox. So I've used that extensively to do, when I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I did a proof of concept. I did all of that in the QA environment. If you didn't have access to a separate environment, which I think would be the best way to go, not just for sandboxing, but also for trying out features, add-ons, whatever, before putting them in production, at the very least, you could set up some sandbox projects in your production instance to try things out in. And then you could say, I'm using a project or maybe a set of projects, and you're designating that as an internal production sandbox, which I don't think there's any negative repercussions to that I can think of. Phil, what do you think?
I would heavily emphasize that the first one you option is definitely the best one. So having some sort of QA staging dev environment copy of your Jira is the safest way to do it. If you do it in production, there's two things to keep in mind. One is if you're new to structure entirely, and this would apply obviously to any other add-on you'd be doing, you have permissions that you can set to limit access to the add-on. And so you can do that first, give it to only a few people who know what the potential repercussions are if they run a JQL query that asks for all of the issues. And so there's the incremental rollout method you can do, especially if structure or whatever plugin you're using is new to the organization. When it comes to sharing the structures themselves, though, you have several other options. Like we showed you today, you can put them in a dashboard, put them in a Confluence page. But the easiest way to do it, in my perspective or my experience, is you create one that you like, and without having to worry too much about it, as long as the other person has the correct Jira permissions, you can go on the top right button, click share, and it creates a perspective link, which basically says, everything you've tweaked, everything you've played with right now in your structure, this is what I'll show to the other person. And that's really helpful when like you are a structure user and you know what you're doing, and someone else just needs the data that comes out of it. They don't need to play with the formulas. They don't need to play with the automation installed. They just want to see the results, and that's it. And that's a great way to do it because they can bookmark it and just keep referring to it as well. So that's another option as well.
And the use of that share button is typically how I share my structures with the people I built them for, rather than sending them the direct link, so they get that perspective view that Phil mentioned.
Excellent. Again, this next question, I think both of you might have a comment. I'll ask Phil to go first. What about sharing? We put our initiatives on Confluence. We document them on Confluence. So how do we share those initiatives with the Jira users who are working primarily in Jira? So Phil, why don't you go first?
Again, you've got multiple options, which is one of the great things about the way Jira and the Atlassian community is set up. From a structure-specific point of view, you can link them. So there's an easy way to link issues and pages together. And Structure has an extension called Structure Pages, which, as the name alludes to, allows you to bring in Confluence pages as long as there's an application link set up. And so you can go in and view the initiatives that are in Confluence at the top level, and then use the automation rules to find all the items under it. And just like if you're normally in Structure and you click on an issue, it'll bring up the Jira issue details. It'll bring up the Confluence page on the right there. So you can share a whole host of issues, whether they're the requirements documentation, change management, if you're doing more traditional project management, or any kind of reference material. And then you can have all that available at one place. What I see a lot is people will actually do their sprint retrospectives and their PI retrospectives that way. So they'll have a structure open that has all the sprints in it, and then at the bottom they'll sneak in the feedback page. And so where the teams go in to look for what the sprints they're working on and what the items are, they have one click away, they've got the Confluence page where they can log all their feedback. And that definitely lowers the barrier towards collecting surveys and doing things like that. It allows you to kind of collect all this in a central place where people can access it. So that's the way to go. Obviously, you can make them users and share them, but you would definitely link the Confluence page to the issues and then visualize them accordingly. And they'll pop up in the issue details page too. So if you go to the issue details, it'll show you under it the wiki pages that are attached to it.
Dan, do you want to add anything?
The technique that Phil described is the one I would recommend as well, especially if you have structure.pages. If you don't, the one thing you could do is a little bit of what I actually showed you in one of my slides, where you actually create an initiative in Jira as well, and then you just link that initiative to the initiative you've described in Confluence. Just make a regular everyday URL link. And then that provides you some structure, no pun intended, in Jira to say how are things related to each other. So you get the best of both worlds.
All right. Next question. Each of you mentioned dashboards, and you showed a Jira dashboard in today's presentation, and you mentioned the ability to do it in Confluence too. How well do those dashboards render in Confluence?
Almost as good as in Jira is the short answer. There's a bit of a lag just because the data needs to go from the Jira instance to the Confluence one, to the application link. So we've noticed that they are a little slower, but not significantly. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that Confluence users don't necessarily have all the permissions that the Jira users do, especially if you're a large organization and you have, say, management that you're reporting to. They're oftentimes only viewers on Confluence and they don't really play in Jira. That could be something to keep in mind, because I've seen this a few times that people would share a page that's where they do their reporting. They'll place a structure gadget or a tempo gadget, for example, in there. But because the user that's looking at it doesn't have the permissions in Jira, it doesn't render. The gadget will render, but the issues won't show up because you can't use any of the add-ons to violate the Jira permissions. And if they don't have those permissions there, they don't have them in Confluence either. So that's just something to keep in mind. But otherwise, they work almost the exact same way.
I would add that that's one reason.
Question. Oh, go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
To finish this up, that's all right, Dave. That's one reason why an open approach, where within a company, you're very open about, let's say, filter permissions, structure permissions, et cetera. That's why that works so well. If you've given access for everybody except for sensitive situations, then you won't run into as many of the problems that Phil described. Go ahead, Dave.
And so the next question is clearly for Dan. And as I said earlier, everyone, we're running up against the clock here, but if we don't answer your question in person today or live, we will follow up with you via email to make sure your questions get answered. So don't worry if we don't get to it. Next question is clearly for you, Dan. It's what areas or what sectors of the market does Slalom or you work in besides FinTech?
Oh, we work in, lots of sectors. We work in retail, food, high tech. We're a technology and business consulting company, but we don't focus on any one sector more than another. And as we're national, we also have, I should mention, we have a local sort of model, so a regional model. So for instance, I work in our Orange County office. We deal with clients in all sorts of industries, but in Orange County specifically. And then our other local offices all over the country, in fact, all over the world, do the same. So yeah, we're very well spread out. Thanks for asking.
All right. Well, given the time, I'm going to say we'll end it here. There's a few questions remaining, but as I said, we'll get to those via email. I want to just remind everyone that today's webinar will be available on YouTube within a day or two. If you're attending this webinar, you're going to get an email about that. So don't worry about it too much, but you can always visit the ALM Works page on YouTube. A short link to get you there is alm.works/YouTube. And on that, on our channel, you'll see a playlist for webinar archives. But you'll receive an email from one of my colleagues in a day or two with a direct link to this webinar. But you can, by the way, when you're there, take a look at the other webinars that are there as well. You might find something useful. If you want to learn more about ALM Works and structure, you can use this short link, alm.works/structure. That's actually a link to the Atlassian marketplace where you'll find structure if you don't already have it. And if there's anything else at all you need from us with respect to today's webinar or just in general, you can drop us a note at webinars@almworks.com. We'll be happy to answer the question for you or route you to the right person if it's not one of the folks who monitored that address to make sure you get the answers that you need. Thank you again, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We hope you found something useful attending today. I'm confident that you did. And thank you, Dan and Phil, for presenting.